All right, well, before we begin, I would just like to state for the record that today is August 2nd, 2022, and my name is Ben Bauman, and I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana, speaking with Robert DuComb, and we are doing an interview for the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. So just starting off, when and where were you born?
I was born on September 3, 1943, in South Bend, Indiana.
Okay, and what were your parents' names?
My father, I'm Junior, Robert James DuComb Jr., so my dad was Robert James DuComb Sr., and my mother was Lucy Azalea DuComb. Her maiden name was Cotter. And they were both raised in South Bend. They were a high school romance that turned into marriage during World War II.
Yeah, wow, okay, that's interesting. And when did your family first get to Indiana?
I don't really know the answer to that question. I have researched back.
Yeah.
My great-grandfather was a farmer in Lakeville.
Okay.
And he and one of his brothers served in the Civil War. And I've been going through, family pictures and stuff, and I found a little tiny, I guess you'd call it tinotype, of four Civil War soldiers. And I know one of them must be my great-grandfather because nobody else would have kept it, except the family. But I can't identify, which one he is.
Yeah.
But so they were here before that. But that's really as far back as I have traced the family. There is another member of the family found that the first DuCombs came in like 1803 into Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
But it's not a very big family. I mean, nationwide, there might be 6 or 8 or 10 families that I've been able to find.
Yeah.
That came, probably all came over from France in the early 1800s.
Yeah, that's neat. Okay. What were your parents' occupations?
My father was an attorney, and my mother basically she worked in manufacturing jobs before they got married. Worked for Singer Sewing and a couple of other companies like that. And then while my dad was practicing law, occasionally she would go in, and be an office assistant and work in the office. But she did not really work outside of the home very much during most of my life.
Okay. And did you have any siblings?
I had one brother named Dale. When I was a senior in high school, we moved up to Cassopolis, Michigan, where I still have a home. And he went to the Cassopolis High School.
Okay.
He was in the Army. He got sick in the Army during training, but still was, recovered enough to spend his 2 years, and then he became a Mishawaka police officer in Mishawaka, Indiana, where he served for 25 or 30 years. And unfortunately, he had a health condition, and he passed away at age 50, which was a big blow to my mother at that time. And anyway, she was, I guess, so unhappy about him passing at such a young age that she had kind of a small stroke, and then she came to live with us the last 3 years of her life.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
So I was grateful to be able to take care of her in the home, and she actually, I kept her out of the hospital pretty much, till near the end when we had hospice then come to the house and help. It was a very big learning experience for me and very moving and emotional.
Yeah, definitely. How would you describe your childhood?
Blessed. I had a really good childhood. In Cassopolis, Michigan, there's a lake called Diamond Lake, and my grandparents owned a cottage there. I spent every summer as a kid up at the lake. On the lake, had a boat and boating and all those kinds of activities. I was the paper boy for 2 or 3 years, and then my brother was. The lake has an island, and there's a ferry that goes from the mainland to the island, and I worked the ferry for a couple of summers, before college.
Okay.
And then my brother did. He was 4 years younger than I am, and he worked it, and it was just really a blessing to be at the lake in the summers, and went to a good high school and had a lot of friends, and some of whom I still see regularly. So I think that was really very good for my life, and so I was I felt very happy and a good. Not that there weren't ups and downs,
Sure.
because there always are, but it was looking back on it, it was a very lucky childhood, and being at the lake, having my grandparents, and I had a great aunt involved in my life, from a very young age. And as my dad said, I was spoiled by all these women while he was off at war, so I was expecting to be treated like that the rest of my life, which didn't quite work out.
Yeah, naturally, yeah.
Right.
Now, what did you know about your family's politics growing up?
Well, I knew that my grandfather had 3 brothers, so there were 4 brothers in that family, all raised in Lakeville. And of the 3 of the 4 brothers became lawyers and practicing in South Bend.
Yeah.
And I've learned just recently that one of my great uncles, my Uncle Clifford, actually ran as a Republican for the Court of Appeals sometime back, and I didn't get the exact date, but I found a poster showing that he was running. But what I first knew about was my grandfather, who was elected the city judge in South Bend, and then he ran unsuccessfully for mayor and had been very active in politics. And then from the days I can remember, my dad was always involved in politics, more on the organizational side. He was campaign manager for candidates. He became district chairman for the state, for Republican district chairman for the 3rd congressional district, and served on the state committee for a number of years.
Wow.
And was very involved in the organizational side. When I was 15, my father ran for prosecutor in St. Joe County, which was about a 2-1 or more Democrat majority. Of course, running as a Republican, it was a very nasty campaign because of the allegations of the misconduct by the prosecutor at that time. I remember getting phone calls at home from people threatening us, because
Wow.
my father was raising these allegations, and unfortunately he did lose the election. 2 years before that, in 1956, he had been the campaign manager for his law partner, F.J. Nimps, who also became my law partner when I got out of law school. And F.J. was successfully elected to Congress in 56, but unfortunately in the 6th year of Eisenhower's presidency in 1958, he got swept out in a big Democrat, kind of landslide, and never returned to Congress. I think he did run one more time, but still lost. So I grew up in a political environment. There's no question about that. And we talked about politics. We had it in the house. And obviously, when I went to law school at IU, and when I joined my dad and FJ to practice law, and that was in 1969, I mean, the place was full of politics. I mean, politicians would come and talk to my dad, who were looking to run for statewide office. They would come in and, try to get his support. And I followed him down to a state convention when they were, still everything was, there were no primaries. Everybody was being picked, in a convention, and watched, how that all worked. So, I had a lot of politics. I really, and I enjoyed it. That's one of the reasons that I did run for the legislature.
Yeah, okay. So, your family was pretty politically involved then?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Wow. Now, before law school, where did you go to school?
I went to Indiana University.
Okay.
And I graduated in 3 years. I went to summer school, and my degree was liberal arts in what they called government, which was political science. That was my degree. That's what I was drawn to. And then I went to law school, right after that.
Okay. And where'd you go to high school?
South Bend Central High School.
Okay.
Which is now an apartment project, and the school is gone.
Oh, wow.
It's been closed, yeah. It was closed in the early 80s, I think, or late 70s sometime, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
We still have reunions.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It won't be mini reunions, I
No,
guess.
that's what. No, not well. They're starting to diminish. It's like an all-school reunion now.
Ah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
We
Okay.
haven't had one just for our class in a while, but
Yeah.
an all-school reunion.
Yeah. It's always strange to hear schools that close.
Yeah. Well, you know, they started building them in the suburbs, and people started moving to the suburbs.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, they built the schools and
Yeah.
eventually closed Central. And they actually were going to tear it down, but it had been built in the early 1900s, and it was so well built that it would cost more to tear it down than it was to renovate it.
Wow. Okay.
So
Jeez.
they decided to turn it into apartments.
That's interesting also. Okay. Did you have any favorite subjects in high school or?
Well, I actually took a lot of math and really enjoyed math. I would say that I liked history, but it was not as well taught as the math. We had a very good math faculty in South Bend, and in English also. My great aunt had been a high school teacher at Central. She had retired by the time I got there. But, you know, some of the people on the English faculty still remembered her. She taught me a lot of English in the summers. She taught me phonics, which wasn't being taught then in schools. You know, it kind of comes and goes. I read, I read a lot, growing up. So I loved English. I loved stories.
Yeah.
I loved books. So I liked all that. But math was a draw just because the faculty was so good.
Yeah.
And a lot of my friends were taking higher math, and I just, I ended up taking calculus and maybe even differential equations
Wow.
in high school. And I continued a little bit in college, but then, when I got really good teachers in politics and history and government, I was drawn much more to that and kind of gave up math.
Yeah. Yeah.
At that point.
Were you part of any clubs or sports teams in high school or college?
No, well, I was in a fraternity.
Yeah.
And, we had a lot of activities. I was in the senior play and not a very glorious role.
Okay.
I can't really remember, I was always active, but I can't really remember the specifics that I was, of clubs and stuff. I had friends, we played basketball together, but my basketball career ended in junior high when I realized that there were people who could run faster backwards than I could forwards.
Okay. Yeah.
And jump up and grab the rim when I'd be lucky to jump up and grab the underside of the net. So after that, it was just kind of what you'd call intramural. And
Yeah.
I enjoyed it a lot, but I was never good enough to be on the team. But I went to the games and
Sure.
cheered them on.
Okay. How did you view Indiana growing up?
I thought it was, a farmer state. I mean, there were farms everywhere. It was home. I really liked it. I liked South Bend. I liked southern Michigan where we went in the summers. I viewed it as kind of a solid Midwestern state. We didn't travel a lot because we spent our summers, at the lake.
Sure.
So I didn't have a lot of experience with other states. But farming was big. So I knew it was a very important part of the landscape. I think while I was in high school, Studebaker's closed, which was a big economic, calamity for the whole city.
Yeah.
A lot of businesses, subsidiary businesses, that made parts for Studebaker. Bendix was in South Bend, making brakes. A lot of those people suffered, tremendously when Studebaker did close. But I think that was, when I got back to practicing law, after, 10 years or so after Studebaker closed, the city was, improving substantially. There was a good, there were financial institutions associated. Associated Finance was very big at that time, which subsequently got sold and, left town, like a lot of them do. But, smaller businesses were picking up, and it began to look more prosperous by the time I got out of law school. But the closing of Studebaker's, and that was tough on the town.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Now, what were your goals after you graduated from college? What was your plan?
Well, after graduating from college, my plan was to go to law school. During my college, I went through ROTC, so I immediately went into the service after I graduated from. I graduated from law school in June, took the bar exam in early July, and by the end of July, I was in the Army.
Okay.
And I served for 2 years as a military policeman.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah. And how do you view your college experiences?
They were good experiences. I made friends, some good friends, still have till this day. My academics were good. They weren't, nobody was looking to me to be valedictorian, but I did well in college, did well in law school. And mostly it was positive. Met my wife in college as an undergraduate. We got married in 1966.
Yeah.
So we had a year or two dating before, before we got married. We got married before my llast year of law school.
Yeah.
So I had 5 years as a bachelor and 1 year as a married man on campus.
Yeah.
And but it was very positive. I'm very loyal to IU. To this day, I feel like it was a very, very good experience. It was a great place to go to college. We went back there this summer. We went to a family reunion down at McCormick's Creek, and we went over and spent a couple days in Bloomington, had dinner with Steve Moberly. I don't know if you've interviewed him. Yep. He's remained a good friend from those days. I know him in college, but got to know him a lot better in the legislature, and we remained friends with him. So it was very, it was very positive. And the further you are away from it, the more positive it looks.
Sure, understandable.
Yeah.
Did your awareness of politics change when you were in college and in law school?
Not really. One of the things you learn in law school, they taught it a little differently then than they do now, I think, is how things work in the world. You study contracts. How contracts, guide the business world.
Yeah.
And you study the legal system, the criminal law and the procedures and everything, and you really learn how things work. And a lot of a couple of people that I went to law school with, went into became lawyers and went into business as opposed to being remaining in the practice of law.
Yeah.
But I think most of the guys I went to law school with stayed in the law. But that's what you learn is how things work, and part of that is, one of the things that was amazing to me, like you have to take federal income tax, which I dreaded even thinking about.
Yeah.
One, because it changes every year, as we all know,
Sure.
when we try to do our tax returns. But what was interesting about that was the political reasons that there were certain things in the IRS code. You sort of get a sprinkling of that. Mm-hmm. How the IRS works, kind of then how Congress works. Obviously business lobbyists are putting things in to the code, so you're kind of learning that, which I was learning at that time. And I also took a course in legislative drafting while I was there. And, how to draft bills and, how that works, how the statutes come together a little bit, through the process. Mm-hmm. So, I got a little more practical knowledge of, how some of these things work. Because it never occurred to me that the Internal Revenue Code was so politically driven, but obviously it is, and it seems even more so, today that the politics is driving what's in the code, and how the taxes are levied and who gets breaks and all that is driven very much by politics. And so I was exposed to that. So that was more the practical side of politics. I'd been exposed because of my dad and FJ, to the put up the posters, walk the streets, do door to door, do advertising, that kind of stuff. The political campaigns
Yeah.
I'd been exposed to and been involved in, not surely not as much as when I was my own campaign, but quite a bit. And there was always a lot of talk about doing that and what had to be done and that kind of thing.
Sure.
So it was kind of a nice blending of both of those. By the time I was out of college, I'd had the practical experience, plus now I was getting some of the practical, this is what happens in politics type stuff from stuff that I learned in law school.
Yeah. Okay. Now, when did you have any children?
Yes, I have 2 children.
Okay.
My older daughter Darby is an attorney living in Seattle we have 2 grandchildren
Oh, okay.
there. And then my younger daughter Dana lives in Phoenix, where we lived for a number of years after we left Indiana. And she has 2 children. Both are still in high school. Both of my Darby's kids, one is out of college and the other one has just started college.
Yeah.
So
okay.
they're of that age, and it's kind of interesting to see what they're doing.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, I mean, just as an aside,
Sure.
Darby, my daughter Darby married another lawyer. She went to law school and married a lawyer.
Okay.
And they're still married. My daughter Dana married a immigrant coming from the country of Colombia,
Oh, that's interesting.
and he got to America with like a 4th grade education.
Wow.
And he started going to the junior colleges in Phoenix.
Yeah.
Got a GED, graduated from junior college, went to ASU, and then wanted to be a lawyer. He came back to Indianapolis and lived here for 3 years and went to the Indianapolis Law School.
Wow.
And graduated from IU and is now practicing law. We practiced together for a number of years in Phoenix before I retired, and he's now practicing in Phoenix.
Wow, that's pretty
Yeah.
amazing.
So the law has been the family business.
I guess
Although
so.
I mean, Darby's 2 kids look more interested in business than they are in the law.
Yeah.
I have no idea what my one grandson will be a senior in high school, and he's looking at college. He thinks he might want to be an engineer or something like that. So we'll see. But
Yeah.
it's the world is different now.
Yeah, it's
It
true.
might be better to be an engineer or in business than to be a lawyer. It's a bigger struggle for lawyers now than it used to be, the way the law is organized.
Yeah, I guess so. It's true. Yeah, it's interesting to see how employment options change over time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's harder for young kids coming out of school to find jobs because law firms just don't offer jobs like they used to.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them have to strike out on their own, and you're not always taught how to. And when you start out on your own, you're a businessman as much as you're
pretty
a
much.
lawyer.
Yeah.
And that's not why a lot of people go to law school. So
Yeah.
I think it's tougher now to get started. I mean, because I was very lucky. I got started with my dad and his law partner, and so that was a very easy transition.
Definitely. Sure. So when did you start thinking about running for office and getting involved in politics?
It was always kind of in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
But I would say what happened in 1970 reapportionment of the legislature accelerated, my thinking.
Yeah.
Because until then, there had not been a Republican elected from St. Joseph County, Indiana, for 40 years.
Wow.
But for most of those years, they elected 5 members of the legislature, all in a group from South Bend, and at that time I think they were electing 15 from Indianapolis, all in a group. It was either 15 Republicans or 15 Democrats. But in St. Joe County, it was always Democrat at that particular time. So the prospects of doing that were pretty slim. And the Congress was a long-serving Congressman, John Bradamus, so that didn't look like an avenue. But, somehow I got information, maybe my dad got it, about the reapportionment of the legislature. And happily, I lived in a township called Clay Township, which was put in a district with some, mostly it was St. Joseph County, northern St. Joseph County, but there was also some in Elkhart, and I lived in the district.
Yeah.
And I think the Constitution requires you have to live in the district for 2 years, before you run. So I lived there 2 years by the time 1972 came along, which was the first election that reapportionment applied to.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I got all the precinct voting stuff from the historic information for that district. And I looked at it, and my dad looked at it, and it looked like there was a possibility that a Republican could win. There were a lot of Democrats in it.
Sure.
It was a little bit Republican leaning, but it wasn't overwhelming Republican like they do the districts now.
Right.
But it was, as we would say, the Republican had a chance. We felt like, and it was a 2-member district. And there was no Democrat incumbent, I don't think, of any note in the district at that time, because they lived in other parts of the county. So I looked at it and thought, well, I have a chance, so I'm going to do it. And got a lot of encouragement from my father and other people. I'd been involved in was a Clay Township Republican Club, and I'd been involved in that since I got back to town in '69, because that's where I lived, in the Clay Township. Yeah. And made a lot of friends there. I actually became the president of the club after a year or so being there. And, so I had kind of a base of support in that area, to get started. And several of the people encouraged me to run. And so I did. And, I remember the lobbyists for some of the things you remember, for the Teachers Association, came to interview me about about my thoughts. It was kind of, that was over. They said, "Oh, why the hell are you running? Republican hasn't won up here for years and years and years. Why are you wasting your time doing that?" So I got my stuff out, and showed them how it was a potential, it was a potential to win. And they hadn't even looked at it like that so much. Anyway, that was kind of an interesting conversation. But you have to look at that. You have to look at that kind of stuff, and that's what I learned, from my dad and FJ. This is what you have to look at, and I was successful, and I saw, it was the Nixon landslide year, so that made it a lot easier.
Sure. Yeah. Now, what was your campaign strategy when you were running for office?
Well, there was a man in South Bend called Jim Carroll, who was a good friend of my dad's, and he was a PR type guy. And basically it was, I'm a lawyer, I was in the Army, I care about the community, I care about, the environment. And, he came up with some themes, but one of them was, clean air and clean water was one of the themes that I used, which is still, unfortunately, issues today.
Yes.
Even more so with the clean air.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing, and then just, basically, my family's connection, particularly in the Republican primary, to the community and their involvement. And I thought, being a lawyer, having served in the service, this was the Vietnam era, and all that was, some people thought that was patriotic, other people thought, you were nuts for being in the service. And I was in voluntarily, I wasn't drafted, I went through ROTC, all of that, a lot of it was just, here I am, I'm a good guy, I'm running, I'm learning how to talk politics, on the stump, so to speak.
Sure.
I went to every meeting I was invited to. I was happy to did a lot of the door-to-door campaigning, and that was, excuse me, that was also the year of the property tax relief issue, and I met Doc Bowen. He came to St. Joe County a lot. He lived down in Bremen. Got to know him. Mm-hmm. Talked to the state people about the property tax, and then I became very much in favor of the property tax relief, because it was getting out of hand proportionally to other kind of taxes.
Sure.
And that that became a big campaign issue as the campaign went along. I mean, I think Doc Bowman was pretty much running on that a lot. He'd been in the legislature, he knew what needed to be done from a statewide basis, and I kind of took his guidance on that. And, I want to say we became friends, but we certainly became acquaintances and
Yeah.
the campaign trail, and, we tried to help him as best we could and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And so that all kind of worked out. But that was the big issue in 1972 that I think, that, and of course, it was just a big landslide year. So
Yeah.
in our area, I mean, I can't remember if Nixon carried St. Joe County, but I mean, he carried my district, about as heavy as you could.
Sure.
The one point of pride is I did get a few more votes than he did.
There you go.
So I felt good about that. But,
Yeah.
So that, that was kind of the theme of that year. And of course, when we got to the legislature, we tried to, I did anyway. A few Republicans didn't, but we had so many. We had 73, I think. 73 Republicans. I mean, it was in the legislature, which was an overwhelming number. I mean, they have those kind of numbers now. And it was kind of unwieldy, but we were, I helped as best I could, to push the property tax relief stuff through for the governor.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Now, you mentioned that you did some door-to-door campaigning.
Yeah.
Did you have any interesting, experiences doing that, or any kind of funny stories? I know that can always be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I can't push it. This particular story,
Yeah.
I can't say, it happened. I mean, because I did door to door in every campaign.
Sure.
But I remember being in one neighborhood where the overwhelming smell of cat got out to got out almost to the street.
Oh, wow, okay.
And, but I mean, a lot of times, the two things that happened to me were, people who would come to the door and take the literature and, just be totally indifferent. So you had no idea, they wouldn't react at all.
Right.
I tried to engage them in conversation, they wouldn't react. And I think that's probably not unusual.
Sure.
And I had stuff designed, door hangers, so if nobody was there, you could just leave it on the door. And of course, other friends could go from place to place, and just leave the door hangers. I had people doing that for me,
Yeah.
who were putting the door hangers on, in other neighborhoods. And I would say, particularly in the first campaign, I got a lot of people who recognized my name, knew my father, and even knew my grandfather in those days, even though he'd been passed away for a while. So, that was always, I guess, encouraging.
Yeah.
And I tried to go, I was, you're always looking for kind of the independent vote, the swing vote.
Yeah. So
I was trying to go to neighborhoods that didn't, in my district, that didn't always vote overwhelmingly Republican, looking to be there, quote, show the flag a little bit, I guess would be the right word, and, try to pick up a few of those votes, which is why I think I ran a little bit ahead of Nixon in that. So that was and then we did another technique, which at that time nobody had thought of, but I thought of it, luckily.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, you had to write, you had to prepare an application for an absentee ballot, and they went, they were mailed into the clerk's office, and there weren't that many, like there are now. There's much more of that kind of voting now than there was then, but it was significant numbers, and even though the Democrats had the clerk's office, I was able, with some help from a couple other people, my dad maybe, to convince them that those were public records that I had a right to see.
Mm-hmm.
So when the applications came in, I said those, I have the right to see, I'd like to see them. And anyway, they set it up. We were able to set it up that I could go in, or somebody from my campaign could go in and write down the names and addresses of the people who had applied for an absentee ballot.
Yeah.
And we would immediately send them a letter, maybe even a postcard, a letter with, my literature and, please vote for me. And I think that's another one of the reasons that, I kind of did so well, is that I, getting extra votes from, there were precincts later when we looked at them where, I got practically every absentee ballot, whether they were Republican or Democrat, because
Sure.
they got the literature from me, right about the time they got their ballot in the mail.
Yeah.
And now, I think it's harder now to make that timing, but it was just very fortunate timing that I was able to do that. And that technique, I think, worked really well. And then the other thing that I did, and I kept that out through my other campaign. After a while, they said I couldn't keep getting the names because they saw how effective it had been. And, so I didn't, I couldn't do that every year.
Yeah.
But we did little postcards, and I found them the other day, and I was going through my stuff, which we would mail to every voter in a district that had, that showed how to, where my lever was, by the number of my lever, where to push my lever, and, tell them where to go vote.
Yeah.
And, we mailed those like 3 or 4 or 5 days before the election, so everybody was getting them on Saturday or Monday, hopefully, before the election. And the feedback, people worked the polls on election day, passing out my literature, and person after person was coming in holding that postcard. It just really worked well.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that we did that I think separated us from other candidates who were running.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. Find any way you can get that.
Well,
through.
you want to get information out. It was the first time I had run, so I was basically running on the family's involvement in politics, the fact that I was educated and had been was supporting Doc Bowen, which I did. I felt very strongly about him after I got to know him, which I did get to know him in that first campaign, and that was one of the things that was kind of interesting and sort of shocking to me, because in my part of the state, which was St. Joe County and Elkhart County, were the two counties I had to work. People just really liked Doc Bowen, and because he came from close by, and he was just, he was very likable. I think, I don't know if you ever met him or, he just was he was a country doctor, and just everything you can imagine of what a country doctor was, he was, and just a great guy. And, so they were flabbergasted, if anybody would be, any Republican would be against Doc Bowen at the time. He just was that popular in our area. Get down to the legislature, and all of a sudden, we have a big majority, and all of a sudden it's pulling teeth to get the Republicans to, put up 51 or 52 votes to pass the property tax relief, which everybody ran on, and which was overwhelmingly supported, by by a lot of voters. Some people are indifferent, but a lot of voters really were, liked that prospect. But of course, we had to raise another tax. We had to raise. I think we raised the sales tax in order to pay for it.
Sure.
Anyway, I was just surprised when we got working on it, how hard it was to get it passed. With the overwhelming Republican majorities in both houses at that time, because of how the election worked out and how many people were willing to, thumb their nose a little bit at Doc Bowen. A lot of whom had served in the legislature with him when he was Speaker. They'd known him a lot longer than I had. So that was a surprise and a disappointment to me. In my first couple of years.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, who was your main opponent when you first ran for office?
Another lawyer by the name of Schmidt.
Okay.
I can't remember who the other opponent was at that time. The first time I ran, because wasn't really on the hustings with them so much.
Yeah.
But then the second time I ran was when it got more interesting, because it was a 2-person district, and the other Republican was a man by the name of Rick Lindsay, and the Dick Bodine, who was running for lieutenant governor in 1972, and of course lost because Doc Bowen and Bob Orr ran, was from Mishawaka, which was in part of my district, and he decided he wanted to return to the legislature. So all of a sudden, in my second election, which was 1974, which was right after Watergate, when everything I thought I was, I had to hide,
Sure.
like Republican, lawyer, incumbent,
Yeah, that's right.
those three things, which I thought I'd run on in 74,
Yeah.
were all, Republicans and lawyers and incumbents were going to jail or, being run out of office because of the dishonesty relating to Watergate. And here's Dick Bodine, who was, been elected many times from Mishawaka to the legislature, had been speaker at one time, was a statewide candidate for governor, was now running against me.
Yeah.
And the thing that they did, which was probably a mistake in the long run, is they went out and recruited Pat Bauer. I don't know, you may have, Pat Bauer's sister, to run against me.
Oh, okay.
So on the ballot, it was Bauer, Bodine, and it was DuComb, Rick Lindsay. Yeah. So Bauer, if you looked at it, you thought I was running against Bauer instead of Bodine. Okay. Yeah. So, and then of course 74 was a very bad year. Yeah. And so I campaigned almost as if I was a Democrat. Yeah. I don't want to disparage my opponent, but Pat's sister did not have a lot of experience. Yeah. Did not want to, she just wanted to, they had a very powerful political name. Sure. Bernie Bauer, her dad, had been in the Senate for a long time, was in the Senate at that time. Pat was in the legislature at that time from different parts of the county, but they had a very powerful name. And so she didn't go even to Democrat functions. So I started doing that. I started going to Democrat, and of course I'd go there and there'd be people that I knew from the courthouse, from the clerk's office, from the treasurer's office, So somebody would always talk to me, although they wouldn't always do that. Sure. But I started doing a lot of that campaigning, trying to hopefully get Democrat votes, because it really did look like a Democrat year in 74. And it was, as a matter of fact, a very big Democrat year. And we went from 73 to 37. We went from the majority to the minority in overwhelming numbers. I don't blame the people. The National Party, Nixon and that crowd had been very dishonest in a lot of ways, and we all, a lot of people paid the penalty for it, but I was able to survive. I worked really hard. This campaign, I probably worked the hardest, did the most door to door. Yeah. Raised the most amount of money, to spend. Sure. But Dick Bodine got elected too. So now we had a district that was split, one Republican and one Democrat. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Interesting how those things work out.
Yeah, it is interesting. It was interesting. I really thought it was probably the end for me that year.
I think a lot of people were concerned about that.
And so I was very grateful to win that election. And
So, what did you think of the election process when you're running all these different campaigns?
I thought it was a fair process. I've always found that the clerks, the people who are, conscientious, who sit there on election day, I'm assuming they still do it the same way, but there were, like 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, almost every precinct, who were election officials, and they were, they were interested in the election being done right. They were honest. They worked hard at it. There was always a meeting the night before, and then I worked the polls. I was a precinct committeeman for a while, so I had to work my precinct. Yeah. And so I got involved in how all the mechanics worked. That was the day of the voting machine. You push a little lever, to vote, and those are long gone. Everything is computerized, I'm assuming. Yeah. But I thought the elections were fair. I thought they were well done. I was very happy. The people from both parties, weren't trying to get. And so I thought the process was very good. It was honest, and and I didn't see any problem. I still don't. I know there's been a big controversy. Yeah. But in the 2020 election, which has become a big controversy, I went and sat in a precinct in Cass County, Michigan for the day.
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought the procedures were fabulous. You know, they were, you know, they had people, they checked everybody's ID. I mean, the people that worked there, I mean, they knew half the people that came in, you know, I mean, which is what you want in a precinct, you know, I mean, that was the way it was in the precinct I was in Clay Township. The people that worked the precinct, I mean, they knew, you know, half the people that came in to vote, you know, they knew the Republicans and half the Democrats that came in to vote in that, you know, in our precinct. And that's the way it was in this one in Cass County. You know, they were, you know, and in fact, I asked the woman who was in charge, there was a little lull at one point, and I said, well, what's the vote here? I mean, is it 2-1 Republican, 2-1 Democrat? What is this? I have no idea. I'm just here to do it right.
Yeah.
You know, and they all were that way. They were totally bipartisan during the whole process up there in Cass County. It's the way it was, as I remembered from from St. Joe County, and I just thought the process was good. And, you know, big controversy in Michigan, but you know, if all the precincts did it the way the precinct I sat in, it was a very fair election.
Sure.
And so you know, it just, I mean, I think the people that are doing that, I mean, one I think they're lying right now to everybody. I mean, Trump in particular is lying about that. You know, he didn't win the election in Arizona, which I'm familiar with. He didn't win the election in Michigan, which I was familiar with personally. And you know, it's just very unfortunate that the election process is being challenged when you know it really hasn't been, and it's been fair and honest for couple of centuries, you know. But I mean, one funny story.
Sure.
about the precincts, because my dad was always involved. At that time, the west side of South Bend was very heavily Democrat, and so, but the Republican Party, had to find 3 people to be Republicans in all these heavy Democrat districts, and so they found people, and I don't know if the party paid them. The party might have paid them, but I know they got paid by the county, so maybe the party didn't pay them. But they were supposed to be Republican precinct workers. You know, they were a judge and a clerk and something else that had specific responsibilities on election day. And my dad said, well, there are some precincts on the west side where we don't even get our poll workers to vote for us, you know.
That's funny.
So that does happen.
Yeah. So what was your reaction when you first found out that you had won your very first election?
Very excited.
Yeah.
Absolutely excited. My father was incredibly happy. Well, we were incredibly happy. I was elated, and it was my father was very happy, which I was very grateful to see. I've got a picture of him smiling, sitting in my house. And I got to go down and be on TV that night. I think it might have been the first time I was interviewed on television that night, because it was a surprise that Republicans were winning legislative seats in the county. But it was a wonderful feeling, and I immediately started deciding what my agenda might be in the legislature. So I. Anyway, it was a very exciting moment for the family and for my friends. We probably had 50 or 100 people in our little house celebrating the victory. And there were other pockets of where people, had parties that I did a little travel around the county to 2 or 3 of those in my district. And it was a very exciting evening because, I had no idea, we had no idea what was going to happen, but it was pretty clear early in the evening. The township that I was in we did our own count, and I was there at that little headquarters. We had somebody run from each precinct or call in the votes from each precinct. And so we knew pretty early that we'd done really well in our area, and then it began to come in from other areas that I had done well. My running partner Rick Lindsay had done well. We'd both done really well in that. I think we elected a state senator at that time too from that area. District was similar, but of course they weren't the same districts.
Sure.
From Elkhart County, and it was just a great evening, and I was very much looking forward to being in the legislature. And I was very fortunate because, I practiced law with my dad and FJ, who were, had politics clear to their bone.
Yep.
And the interests of the community, very much so. And so they were willing to help, keep my law practice alive when I went off, for 2 or 3 months. I'd come home on weekends and work on weekends at the law practice. But I mean, they were very, very supportive in every way you can imagine of my political activity, which, probably would have been much harder. I mean, it would have been impossible if they hadn't been supportive.
Yeah, of course.
But it was, that was one of the wonderful things about it. I mean, we just, the three of us in this building that they owned, it was just wonderful,
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Awesome experience. Now, did you end up changing your campaign strategies throughout the course of your political career, or?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, like I said, in '74, it was hard to run as, as what I was, a lawyer and an incumbent,
Yeah.
and a Republican. So we downplayed that, like, people have done. We downplayed all of those things,
Yeah.
although, they should have been things that were, would be very successful for a rerun.
Yep.
And, ran more on just, what I had done, the property tax relief and the other things I tried to do in the legislature. And, just on a personality, type basis.
Yeah.
And that was successful. Then later, then it became more, this is my legislative record. I've done all these, I've done all these things. I've worked on, these are the kinds of things I've supported. You need to keep supporting me because you want these kinds of things, to go on. I got support. I mean, I was a strong, was a strong supporter of public education. Caveat, my wife was a public school teacher and my younger daughter was a public school teacher, but my great aunt had been a public school teacher, but I had a strong affinity for, supporting the public schools.
Yeah.
And so I always had a lot of support from the Indiana State Teachers Association because of that, the support that I had for education, which a lot of, eventually during my legislative process, they became, they didn't support as many Republicans because Republicans weren't as supportive of public education.
Yeah.
But I always was, and, they always supported me and always stayed in their corner. But that became less of a Republican selling point than it had, in the beginning. We never really did much that I can remember in my legislative career, for the, pro-environment. I mean, we weren't anti-environment, but, there just wasn't a lot being done. So I, didn't emphasize that kind of thing as much.
Sure.
But it was more running on my record, later on in the process. But I still, I still pounded door to door every campaign, and my district never changed, so it was always, I try to hit as many neighborhoods as possible. You couldn't, I think 100,000 people in the district, you couldn't go to every door yourself.
Yeah.
And I had people that would go to other doors and, put literature in mailbox. Well, they didn't put them in mailboxes. I'd take that back, but they weren't supposed to anyway. But
Right.
Occasionally they did. Occasionally the post office would return a bunch to me with a nasty letter. You're not supposed to put those in. But the techniques, the direct technique of trying to see as many voters as possible. I mean, all of my legislative career, I would send out letters, in April or March or April, to all of the civic groups in town, say, I'm happy to come and give a talk. I gave hundreds of talks, to small groups in all kinds of civic groups, Kiwanis, those kind of meetings, and other groups, political and non-political.
Yeah.
This is what we did in the legislature, and take questions. I was always happy to take questions and try to answer them. To the best of my knowledge, I never dodged a question the way a lot of legislators and congressmen are doing now. They never show their face, in a situation where they can be questioned. But I didn't, I felt that wasn't the job. The job was to go out there and talk to people And I did that as much as I could. And I think, I mean, that just built, over the years. I just had, got a lot of exposure because of the talks that I gave and the other, the work like that I did.
Yeah.
Which, helped build a strong base of support for me.
Sure. What were you thinking when you walked into the State House for your first day in office?
Wow. Here
Yeah.
I am. This is going to, this is where the statutes I read in law school and the ones I read being a lawyer, this is where they're drawn up. And,
Yeah.
I had a sense of wonder, I guess, and, part of the process. And of course, I was a newbie and there were a lot of people there, had a lot of experience. And I made friends pretty quickly with Ned Lampkin. We just were very simpatico on beliefs and issues and, things we wanted to accomplish. And he became and has remained a very good friend to this day. Mm-hmm. And other people like Ray Richardson, there were more. There were a bunch of lawyers in the legislature. I had, in the beginning, I think I probably talked to them more than others because we were all dealing with some of the same kinds of issues for the first time. Some of whom became lobbyists. They were retiring leaving the legislature about the same time I was, but they went into lobbying. Guys like Nelson Becker, Tom Fricknick, people like that, who, I became friends with them. They were good guys. They were smart guys, well thought of on both sides of the aisle. That's one of the things that, that did happen, and at least did happen in the 70s, is that you had friends on both sides of the aisle that you could work with. And I talked to you earlier about Dick Mangus, who was a very, very good friend of mine, and he was a Republican. Yeah. But he was able, he would help the Republicans and me when it was helpful. He would work the rural farmer type, people in the legislature from the Democrat side. He made good friends with a bunch of Democrats, from rural areas, over the years, and that he could get them to support things, that I was working on personally. And sometimes he couldn't. You can't sometimes talk people into things, but you do try.
Sure.
So that's part of what I did the first couple of years, and
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. How did you know the needs and wants of your constituents? What was your way of figuring that out?
Well, part of it was just from the campaign trail. We obviously, in that particular one, in the first one, we were pushing the property tax relief, which, everybody that I talked to seemed to be in favor of that. But, you would, in the first campaign, I was going to more Republican meetings than I would say independent meetings. I still tried to, reach out to, the Kiwanis type, and get some speaking engagements like that, but it didn't get very many that first campaign. But, I'd go to a lot of Republican meetings and people would just say, this is what this is what we're interested in. I sent out questionnaires, these are the things we're looking at. Do you like this or don't like this? Some people would send them back, with little comments. This is what I'm interested in. And of course, then once you start in the session, you start getting a lot of letters from people who are telling you, what they're thinking. And one of the things two things. I still believe, and I did believe at the time, that lobbyists present a point of view, but they're very valuable because they do give you a point of view. Mm-hmm. And if they're well organized lobbyists, then pick one. Restaurant Association. They have people. Restaurateurs from South Bend would contact me. These are the priorities for this, and they would contact me. This is what our group is interested in. And that worked for a lot of the different interest groups, police and fire and whatever. I didn't have a lot of I had some farmers. I didn't have a lot of farmland and farmers, but I still heard from the Farm Bureau and those kinds of people, because there were farmers in my district. A couple of my townships were pretty sparse populated and had a lot of farms in them, but it was not a heavily farm district. But once you get down there, then the lobbyists start to work on it. They have all kinds of meetings and dinners, and where you can get to know them. And the well-organized one have people from your district or your county, who contact you with, these are the concerns of our particular industry. And, you try to take this into, I always took them into account. I didn't always agree with them because there were other factors, but I always took them into account. I always tried to be polite to them and find out what they were interested in. And if it was somebody I knew or had met, in the South Bend area, I'd be more than happy to talk to them and try to steer the conversation sometimes into other issues to see what they thought about those.
Yeah.
But you don't lack for contacts from constituents. At least in those days, you didn't. You got a lot of them, so you knew what people were thinking. I mean, you got some kooks and nutcases. There was some Ku Klux Klaner from Terre Haute area or something that wrote us a letter every year that was almost incomprehensible.
Yeah.
But and I was. I did work on weekends, but I would go to, if somebody invited me to meetings or somebody wanted to talk to me, I'd be happy to go see them. That was, luckily, that was the day before cell phones, so, you could, you didn't get every call that came in.
Yeah.
The way with the cell phones now, I think they must be inundated with people calling them and trying to bend their ear. But I tried to return every phone call. I tried to respond to every letter. That was just something I thought you should do, and I did it all the time when I was in the legislature. Even if I didn't agree with somebody, I tried to explain to them why I didn't. But a lot of people just took the letters and threw them in wastebaskets. But I didn't. I felt the job was to respond to those letters. Now, if they were clearly, if I was getting a letter from Evansville, that was pretty low on my list of returning the things. And if I got a whole bunch of form letters, because that would happen sometimes, that some group would get all their people to send the same exact letter. So, you'd send a form letter back, explaining why you believed that, you agreed with them or didn't agree with them or whatever. Yeah. And I tried to do that. But I think you got a pretty good idea of what people thought by what they were saying to you in letters and phone calls. And, if they'd buttonhole you when you were back home, which, of course, once the session was over, then you had, several months of, being in the community.
Right.
And as I told you, I tried to reach out and talk to as many groups as possible, just because I thought that was part of the job. And it was as also building a base of people who knew me anyway. Mm-hmm. Which is always important. Get your name recognition up, so to speak.
Sure.
That was part of campaigning, but also part of finding out what people wanted. And you'd go to a meeting and there'd be 20 people there, and inevitably, you talk about what you thought interested them, and then they'd ask questions, and then some. Usually before you got out of the room, 2 or 3 people would come up and sort of buttonhole you and. Give you an earful if they didn't agree with you, or talk to you about some stuff. And so once I was elected, I thought it was, I wouldn't say I had my ear to the ground, but I'd say I got a lot of information about what people thought, what they were interested in, and because of my connection to Dick Mangus, who represented a totally different constituency. His was almost all farmland, also Elkhart and St. Joe County at the time. He had a whole different group of people that were bending his ear. And so, we talk about, this is what somebody said to me, and, this is what they're interested in. And, he had issues that I was happy to help him on that I never would have thought of that related to farm country, so to speak.
Right.
That's what I tried to do, and that worked out pretty much, I think, for a lot of people. And it's for me in the beginning, it was a learning process. I didn't know what the hell an REMC was. until I was in legislature. These guys are getting these huge, I didn't have any REMC in my district, so I had no idea what it was, They're getting these stacks of postcards,
Yep.
about some issue, and so, I learned about that, what those were. Because you are ignorant. Anybody that goes to the legislature and says they aren't ignorant of half or three quarters of what goes through there is blowing smoke, because you are. You learn about all of those things if you've been there a while, but when you first get there, there's a lot you just don't know, and so that's a process of learning.
Sure.
And you got to keep your mind open for it, which I'm not sure everybody does for learning.
Do you remember the first bill that you sponsored or authored?
No, I don't. One of the things that I did work on is that we had a serious issue with annexation, the cities annexation the rural areas into the cities, which the people in the rural areas that I represented were very much against. And I can't remember if that was my first year or, a couple years into it, but that became a big controversy. And I did put a bill in that went, that eventually went through, but I think that was later. One of the first things I started doing, and I think it was in '73, is I felt very strongly about the bad effects of smoking. Unfortunately, both my parents smoked heavily, and I grew up, with what they called secondhand smoke. I did, and I came with a real strong prejudice against smoking, and I put in anti-smoking bills, if that's the right word, every year, and pushed them, and sometimes I got them through the House, but I never got anything into law. But things eventually got into law. People I served with eventually got the stuff, got bills passed, where there's no smoking legislation now, no smoking in a lot of buildings and, restaurants. The Restaurant Association, was basically went up and, they went up the tree, they were so unhappy about it. The first ones I put in were just, you can't smoke in the public parts of public buildings. I felt if you had to go to the clerk's office, you shouldn't have to inhale a whole bunch of smoke while you're doing business with the clerk and that kind of thing. So that's what I started with. I may have started with something stronger, but I was willing to cut it back to get that, to get that through. But now, it's accepted everywhere, you can't smoke in restaurants, which is one of my big objections. I just hated to go into a restaurant and have a table next to me, everybody's smoking away. So that was one of my personal proclivities to push. I meant to go back and look at some of that stuff, but I just didn't do it. So I don't know the specific bills.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, but that was one of my. And I beat that hammer the whole 10 years. That I was there, and gradually got more. And more success with it, but it never came to fruition. And the governor, Governor Bowen, being a doctor, he was supportive, but I never could get it to his desk. So it wasn't one of the things he was going to put high on his list. Unfortunately, I tried to get that done, but he just had so many other things that you couldn't get that done. And we had some funny moments, in the discussion, with it. I remember Jerry Rep. I don't know, did you ever do him? He was from up in Lake County, and he was a smoker. And he got up and quoted something about the sex appeal of smoking, and he said, as for me, I just can't afford to give up any sex appeal, so I'm against it. But and that the other sort of environmental bill. I considered that an environmental bill, an indoor environmental bill.
Yeah.
That I pushed was also kind of funny. I pushed at the time. We summered in Michigan, and they had had a bottle bill, you had to pay a deposit if you got your bottles. And it was remarkable, the difference between St. Joe County and, the counties in Michigan on how much litter was in the road. Because, you throw the bottles and the cans, people just throw bottles and cans out the window, they weren't worth anything.
Yeah.
And that was before there was even much recycling. And, in Michigan, they were worth a nickel or something, now they're worth a dime. People didn't throw them on the side of the road, it really helped with the littering to have that bill.
Yeah.
But, anyway, I ended up with, 13, 14, 15 sponsors, everybody thought it was a good idea. And then the lobbyists went to work.
Oh, no.
And, it turned out, the bottling plants thought this was going to, it turned out there was probably a bottling plant in every legislative district in the state.
Oh, no.
And anyway, they put it up they let it vote, go to the House floor and vote, and as my friend John Colden said, you didn't even carry your sponsors, they lobbied so hard that the people who had sponsored it didn't vote for it.
Wow.
It did not do well. It was a big El Stinko, but
Yeah.
they put it on the floor as a favor to me, but it was an embarrassing moment. But,
Okay.
it's never come in Indiana, and now that, of course, a lot of people go around and recycle them, so
Yeah.
there's less litter. But it was, sort of an anti-littering thing.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Now, generally speaking, when you were serving, how hard was it to get a bill passed in the General Assembly? If it was a somewhat controversial bill?
Well, the more controversial, the more difficult it was.
Sure.
One of the things I first did in the legislature, one of the things that happened in the first campaign when I was running, we did have a few forums, Republicans and Democrats were in the same room, having a Republican-Democrat forum. And at that time, all the judges in the county were elected. And so, we'd go to these meetings, and of course the judges are articulate lawyers, and so they're giving these fiery partisan speeches against Nixon, and, against Republicans in general, which I thought was inappropriate for judges to do. Mm-hmm. And it also turned out then to become, to get elected as a judge, as a Democrat, you had to tithe to the party. Mm-hmm. So 10%, you had to give 10% of your salary, which was pretty modest actually for lawyers in the 1970s, to the party as a contribution to be slated. They did slating in those days. The party said, vote for these guys for judge. And I thought that was totally inappropriate. And I saw one of the judges just rake Dick Bodine over the coals. I'm waiting for my turn, and he's up there with a divorce client or some case, mm-hmm. Just rake him over the coals. And it was all because he hadn't supported some judge pay raise or something.
Yeah.
That didn't really come out in the thing, but I asked Dick about it later, what the hell was all that about, And he said, I didn't support this or that or something that they wanted. And I just thought all that partisan politics from judges was wholly inappropriate. Yeah. So I lobbied through a bill, I think in my first year, which was a bill which created a system of governor appointments of the judges. And what you did is you created a panel. One of the members of the Supreme Court sat on it, and then there were lawyer members and public members. And when there was a vacancy, then this commission would nominate they had to nominate at least three. They could nominate as many as they wanted, and the governor would pick off of that list.
Yeah.
And I got that passed in 70, I'm pretty sure 73, it might have been 74. I'm pretty sure I got it passed in my first term. I ran on that as, judicial reform, and that was extremely difficult because it was in some ways it was a little bit partisan because I was against the partisan politics that was emanating from the bench. And a lot of people felt, well, I want to be able to vote for my judges. In fact, Marion County, I don't know what their system is now, but they put in a system that, I mean, maybe there were 20 when they first put it in, judges in Maricopa County, and each party would run 11, so that at least 8 or 9 from each party would be elected. I mean, I don't know how they worked that out, but, it still remained partisan elections of some one kind or another. I mean, that was controversial with Democrats, obviously, because they didn't want, to give up the power of electing these guys. Yeah. And a lot of Republicans were against it because they came from counties where you voted for the judge and they wanted to keep it that way. They didn't say anything wrong with the system because they didn't see the bad parts of it. The way I saw it. Yeah. So I mean, I had to go around. I did go around, door to door, so to speak, or legislator to legislator, trying to gin up the votes. And, so it was very, very hard. And in most of my bills, if there was any controversy or at all, even if there wasn't a controversy, I won't say it was door to door, but it was similar to that. I would try to go to talk to as many legislators as I could. Yeah. You could talk to your own legislators in the caucus, obviously, in the speech kind of thing. But basically, I'd go around and count votes. I mean, that was part of what I did to get my legislation passed, or legislation I'd agreed to co-sponsor for somebody in the Senate, which there was sometimes there was that. Sure. But I don't think I got much of that the first year or two because I was a rookie and the senators that were passing stuff, new representatives. And then I'd go work the Senate. You had to go find somebody in the Senate to sponsor your bill, and then you had to help them, get it going, push, put the pressure on to get it assigned to committee, all the different steps you have to go through. You had to put pressure on, to get the bill heard, to get the bill voted on in committee, So it was hard. I mean, that bill was hard. I mean, I had to talk to everybody and, try to get favorable editorials from the papers and things like that in our county. And I mean, it was good. It was able to be persuasive because obviously it only applied to St. Joseph County. It didn't apply anyplace else. So, the other counties where they wanted to keep their judges, I could always assure them that, I'm not coming for Adams County, Right. It's that's all my concern is here where we've got a bad system. And, I was successful with that. And, but that is hard work. Sure. I mean, some are mom and pop type stuff that, it's easy to get the votes. I mean, they're just there. Particularly that first year, with that many Republicans, if you could stir up your own party, you could get things passed. But, I mean, I always tried to get Democrats to sponsor the bills with me if they would, and to help me, with their caucus. I don't know if they do that anymore, but it was almost a regular process of getting people from the other side to support your legislation. Then after, the first year we had the overwhelming majority, then we went into the minority. Then when we got back in the majority, we had very, very slim majorities from 77 after the 76 election, through when I left the legislature in 82. Very small, nothing like 73, very small. So you really had to work hard. I think we had one year we had 51 or 52. And you just had to work really hard to get, both parties on something that wasn't a real partisan issue. Yeah. To get to get the votes. I mean, and that's how you were successful. Or, one of the things that Dick Mangus taught me, which I hadn't ever thought of, was you got to get some of these lobbyists to support your stuff. So, obviously the judge's bill that didn't have, there was no lobbyist that was going to work on that. But other bills, there are lobbyists who are interested, or you can get them interested, how it affects their group. and get their help. And Dick was kind of a master of that, of finding lobbyists who would support a bill for, help you get it passed. That was one of the things I learned from him, because it never occurred to me until he started talking to me about it, that that's what you needed to do. And so, I did that. If there was a lobbyist or 2 or 3 lobbyists where they could be helpful, because it helped their group, you try to explain to them why it helped your particular group and get them to help you push it through. And, just like with legislators, I don't know, I wouldn't say you made friends, although I did make friends with 2 or 3 lobbyists pretty well. A couple from the South Bend area I became pretty good friends with. But basically, it was more of my interest and your interest are aligned. Would you help me with it?
Sure.
And sometimes they would, sometimes they said, no, we got other fish to fry, and they wouldn't help. But they would remain neutral or something like that. They wouldn't try to stop it. And then, of course, when you had the lobbyists trying to stop it, then you had other things to overcome. You had the people that they could talk to, you had to go talk to them and see if you could peel some of them away from the particular lobbyist. I had no luck with that with my smoking bill. Or with my environmental, the bottle bill, as I called it, trying to.
Right.
But, other things, sometimes you could, peel some people away, and you had to get that knowledge, who really influences, which lobbyists really influence these legislators.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to say, and it's probably might even be worse now, there were some lobbyists that had inordinate influence on some legislators.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and I can't, I wouldn't name names if I could, but I can't remember. But I mean, that's something that came up a lot. Where people got campaign contributions, so you had to be, you had to listen to them. I mean, I always listened to everybody that gave me money, even if I didn't agree with them. That was one of the hardest things that I ever did in the legislature, was talk to some really good friends who'd worked like hell to get me elected in '72 and in '74, and explain to them why I was supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. When they were having, conniption fits. They were very conservative. They were conservative people. They were people that had been my friends. But you have to do that sometimes. That was one of the hardest things I did, but I did it. And you sometimes have to talk to your friends and tell them, I'm not with you on this, and try to explain to them why, and hopefully you don't lose them as voters or helpers. And I never did, really, although they didn't like that I was, sponsoring that particular bill or particular thing. But, I felt very strongly about it. I wasn't going to give it up, and I didn't.
Yeah. Well, so the Equal Rights Amendment was obviously a really big thing when you were serving. So what were like the main sort of debate being had at the time?
Well, early on, in fact, I just looked at it in '72 when I ran in the '72 Republican state convention. They pretty much said they approved. The Republicans approved of the concept of the Equal Rights Amendment, and there really wasn't that much opposition early on until Phyllis Schlafly and the right, the very, very conservatives just started, going cuckoo. I won't say cuckoo, but objecting very heavily. Yeah. And of course, many, when it came to Indiana, then we were very important, because we were like. If we passed it, they only needed 1 or 2 more for it to become part of the Constitution. So it became a real battleground. In the beginning, I think, early on, I think in the early '70s, most people thought, it's a good idea. Equal rights, women ought to have their rights, the same as men. Everybody didn't agree with that. There was always a misogynist running around here and there. But then it became just a real huge political football in Indiana and in every place in the country, because the real conservatives, conservatives, they really got organized and marches and stuff. It was. Part of it was just well, it's vague, in some ways it was, but a lot of our Constitution is vague,
Sure.
the 14th Amendment, the incrimination amendment, all those are, intentionally vague, open for some interpretation,
Yeah.
In my lifetime, and we went with, you didn't have to incriminate yourself till you had to have a lawyer before
Yep.
you incriminated yourself, I mean, that, a big change. But it was like, well, we don't know what'll happen, I mean, terrible things, women will be suing everybody everywhere, for everything, which of course has happened anyway,
Yeah.
even though they were against the amendment. And, I think there was a lot of misogyny in it that wasn't necessarily expressed, as directly as it is sometimes, but I think there was a lot of that just anti-woman.
Yeah.
We've got, a lot of it was, we have a special place, we're being taken care of, our husbands are taking care of us. They'll stop doing that, if we've got equal rights.
Yeah.
We want to be homemakers. I said, nobody's telling you you can't be a homemaker, but they were worried that their what they considered to be a protected place was going to go away. Which of course you tried to explain to them that their place isn't so protected.
Yeah.
I tried to raise my girls with the idea that you have to take care of yourself. You can't count on a man. Luckily they both got very good men, but you can't count on a man to take care of you. He could die, for one thing. People do die even at young ages, and you could get divorced, or whatever. All kinds of terrible things can happen, and a woman needs to be able to take care of herself. And that's why I wanted to get them educated, which, we really pushed education in our house. And that's sort of the same thing, the privileged place that women thought they had, was subject to being ripped out from under them any minute because of something like, a death, a divorce, or, a guy loses his job, and all of a sudden, they have to go to work, And I was seeing all that kind of stuff in my law practice. I did divorces, we did everything in our practice. My partner FJ did estates, and just, people who had their economic pins knocked out from under them through no fault of their own. But that was an argument that people made, the women made, that we have all of this, we're pampered and protected, and we're going to lose that. And I felt that was a silly argument.
Right.
But that was very important to a lot of women, and that there were a lot of women that were against it. A lot of women against it to this day. Against law mandated equality. There's a little more anti-discrimination stuff in statutes now than there used to be, but they still don't have the basic constitutional protection. And I think if that had passed, we might not have quite so much controversy over abortion that we have now. I think it would be harder to put women in jail for having a procedure, getting reproductive health care. But that's what's going on. I'm not following it closely, but I have been reading about what's going on in some states, and that, we're going back to that. Where in some states, you'll go to jail if a woman gets an abortion.
Yeah.
And doctors will go to jail. And I think a lot of that might have been prevented by the Equal Rights Amendment. But I don't know, how that obviously would have been interpreted, because it would have been interpreted. But I felt it was something that was important to do, and I did sponsor it. And it's one of the things I'm proudest of, being a sponsor of the last state that actually ratified it. That was because there was a lot of public opposition to it. It just grew and grew and grew. As more and more states passed it, that's when it just grew and grew and grew. The opposition to it did. And it was, to me, it was too bad. And Republicans abandoned it, even though Republicans had been in favor of it. They did abandon it in many ways. But the leadership stayed with it, and so we were able to get it. We were able to get it through the House and the Senate, and I feel really good about that, even though it's not the law of the land. I think it has moved some legislation to protect women. But I think this latest spate of anti-abortion stuff is going to be very punitive towards women, and I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So, yeah, that makes me think then, what was the abortion debate when you were serving in the General Assembly?
Well, Ray Richardson played a very big part in that, and we just kind of revisited it last night. I had dinner with Ray and Ned last night, and I mean, Ray was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I guess, I think at the time, and basically he just said, after the decision came down, he just said, nothing is going to pass that goes beyond what the Supreme Court has said, and our statute is going to reflect, the issues that the Supreme Court resolved, and we're not going to do anything, we're not going to do anything beyond that. And he was able to prevail in our caucus, in the Republican caucus, and with the Senate to pass a statute that at that time just sort of mirrored the Supreme Court decision. This is these are when you have the rights, and this is when it can be restricted.
Yeah.
Like the third trimester, I think, in the Roe v. Wade decision. And everybody accepted that. I mean, Ray talked last night about a conference committee, and in which a very conservative Republican senator served on, who accepted all of that thinking at the time, and it really never came back after that. When it was passed, the Roe v. Wade came down in '73, and by the end of that session, I think we'd passed that statute that mirrored the thing, and it never changed. It never came up again. I mean, this is a right that women have, and only later then did the states start to, well, you got to have permission of your husband. You've got to have, you got to have waiting periods. All this other stuff that came up, and I think they said last night, Ned said that like there are 55 restrictions in the Indiana law. I mean, before this whole, before they threw Roe v. Wade out at the Supreme Court level, and all kinds of states mirrored that. I lived in Arizona; they did the same thing. And I never did a count, but they were always, coming up every year, coming up with a new restriction to make it harder and harder for women to exercise their constitutional right. It was, it was unfortunate, but that's that's what happened in many states. Some of the same states now that are banning it, completely. I think it's kind of unfortunate. I think we're going to have a real litigation and health crisis. I don't know if it will be a crisis, but health issues in this country for years as a result of that and what's going on in state legislatures now.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for never-ending lawsuits.
Oh yeah, it's going to employ a lot of lawyers over the years. There isn't any question about that.
Yeah.
And it's going to scare a lot of people. It's going to hurt a lot of people. And it's going to be a very difficult thing to go through. I mean, to me, there are a few issues, and that would be one of them, that we really should have a national policy. Another one is same-sex marriage, which I think is going to be challenged here again pretty soon by somebody. At least that's what Justice Thomas said. You need a national policy on that kind of an issue. To me, anyway, you need to have a national policy, and we have one now, pretty much. But it's at the Supreme Court could say, like with this one, it's up to the states. Some states can accept same-sex marriage, and some states don't have to. And I think that's, I think those things are so important to so many people, who have same-sex partners, that, and have children. It's just really, if that gets changed, I mean, I think that would be even as unfortunate as what's happened here with abortion. But you need national policies on that. I mean, Clarence Thomas even intimated that the decision, I think it was Griswold versus Connecticut, which I studied in law school, that said you have a right to birth control
Yeah.
is at risk. Now, I don't know if that'll happen, but I mean, who knows? I mean, the legislature that will, have no exceptions, for any, for some woman who gets raped or, whose uncle impregnates her or something, incest. I mean, why wouldn't they say, you can't take birth control in our state? I mean,
Yeah.
which is what the law was in Connecticut until that lawsuit, which to me, that's ridiculous, but
Right.
somebody may do it. I mean, I think that will be much harder for a state to do than some of the stuff they're doing now. But you need to have national policy on some of this stuff. And,
Yeah.
a hodgepodge of states. I mean, it's going to be a mess in the abortion area to have such a hodgepodge of laws around the country.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. The states are trying to say, if you're a citizen of our state and you go to a state and have an abortion, we can still charge you criminally with doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's totally unconstitutional, but some states are going to do it.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because you served in, I guess the 70s and 80s. When you compare the time that you were in politics to politics today, like, what's that like for you? Does it seem like totally different worlds, or does it seem like, these recurring issues that never fully went away just popping up?
Yeah. Well, it's very disquieting to see what's happening now with a lot of the social issues, I mean, if you want to call them that.
Yeah.
In particular, but when I served, there was a lot of friendship, if that or friendly relations between the two parties.
Yeah.
When I served, it seemed like, I guess the way to put it, seemed like there were 8 or 10 issues that were partisan issues. And we had the caucus on them, and we caucused on more than that, but there were 8 or 10 issues, budget being the main one, tax policy, election laws, those things that were very clearly basically partisan issues. And we had to, we had to drum our caucus into them. And the Democrats the same way when they were in charge. There was 8 or 10 or 12 issues that you had to, every year, the governor had a list. I mean, Doc Bowen did, Bob Orr did when I was there, and those were issues that you had to do your best to get the Republicans to support, because that's what the governor wanted. It didn't always happen, but those were partisan issues.
Yeah.
Everything else was more rural, versus cities, perspectives, different kinds of perspectives that people had, labor against management, that kind of stuff that went across, different lines and weren't wholly partisan. And everything wasn't wholly partisan. Now it appears to me like everything is partisan. I mean, every decision, to adjourn is a partisan decision.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems that it's gone crazy with regard to making things partisan. I mean, the Republicans in the Senate just voted against veterans in this country who got hurt in Iraq with some kind of burn pile. I never even heard of that being a problem, but they decided that was a step too far, and they the Republicans in the Senate all voted against it. I mean, I think they voted, at least they made it lose. They didn't. I won't say they all voted against it because I didn't follow it that closely. But they've made. I mean, everything has become partisan and bitter. And I mean, my friend Dick Mangus was telling me that in the mid or late '80s about how partisan it was becoming and how uncomfortable it was becoming, because there was this partisanship and anger and lack of comity between the parties that didn't exist when I was there, didn't exist when Ned was there, didn't exist when Dick Mangus and I were serving at the same time. And I think that's very unfortunate that that's happened, because you have to work together. I mean, there are different perspectives, and nobody's got the right answer. Mm-hmm. They just really don't have nobody has the right answer. And to make it, to make it a Republican issue that transgenders can't play on high school sports, which is, or, to have a state law that says, which they were trying to do in Arizona last year, you can't, have any medical procedures relating to transgender until you're 18 or something, I mean, all those kinds of decisions become they become wholly partisan. And it's unfortunate because they should not be partisan issues. They need to look at how all these kinds of things affect people. But now, I mean, we just wake up every day with some issue that is just, this is a Republican issue and therefore we're all for it, and the Democrats are all against it. No, this is a Democrat issue and Democrats are all for it, and the Republicans are all against it, and it makes for terrible government. And I think that's what we've had in state and federal legislatures. We have bad government because of the lack of cooperation that ought to exist. They keep talking, the U.S. Senate, the greatest deliberative body in the world. They don't deliberate anymore. They don't do it. You watch the Senate floor, somebody gets up and speaks, there's nobody there listening to them. It's all just politics. I'm sure there's more deliberations in committees and, behind closed doors and all that shows publicly. But publicly, the face of politics is just this hard partisan divide that seems right now unbreachable. And it's really a shame. I think certain medias have made that even more hard to deal with. And that's unfortunate. But you have to have the perspective of people who are elected, around the country for Congress, around the state. You bring those perspectives to the legislature, and you have to, they're all different. They aren't all the same, and you have to meld those together to do right by all the people in the state. That's one of the things I said in my farewell address when I left, and I wasn't really retiring because I was a young man still. But, the legislature has to talk to people who aren't represented by big lobbying groups. You have to understand their perspective, and you have to bring that to the legislature. I mean, the lobbyists bring the perspective of their lobbying groups. The Restaurant Association, I don't mean to pick on them, the teachers, farm bureaus, all of those lobbyists, successful lobbyists, which there are plenty, several of whom I served with who were very successful in the 80s and 90s. As I said, they have their place, but they have their voice. But you don't have the voice of the other side of the equation if you don't listen to people who are not represented, by lobbying groups. And if you only listen to the leaders of, the pretended leaders of your party or the elected leaders of your party, presidents, senators, speakers, presidents of senates, and all of those kinds of people. If you only listen to that small perspective of leadership, you're not serving all the people. You're serving a very narrow part of the people. And it's wrong. In my view, it's wrong. And it was never like that. At least I never felt it was like that, except on a small range of issues that were, partisan. But now, just everything is seemingly I'm not close to it anymore. I did do some lobbying in Arizona for Planned Parenthood, and so I saw that was happening in there. Same thing was happening in the Arizona legislature. It had happened. A lack of friendship and just being kind and to each other was disappearing in Arizona, and Dick Mangus was telling me at the same time, in the 90s, it was disappearing in Indiana. And he really decried that. I'm really sorry you didn't get a thing with him, because he had a really different perspective. But I would, I'd see him every summer, almost every summer, and we'd talk about that, and he'd talk about what was going on and how, he didn't like it as much anymore because it wasn't as friendly. And it wasn't as, working together, trying to solve problems instead of trying not to solve problems. I don't know how anybody people feel differently about global warming. But global warming has been a partisan issue for 20 years.
Yeah.
And like Ray Richardson last night said, it's over. We've lost to global warming. And maybe we have. I don't know. I mean, some people
Right.
still think there's things we can do, but we have lost. And I mean, the last vote in Congress. I mean, they finally got. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Mitchell or whatever is the senator from West Virginia to agree
Manchin,
with to agree with the Democrats in putting forth something with regard to global warming. But I mean, they're doing it with a legislative sleight of hand, and very few Republicans, or maybe no Republicans, will support taking any steps at all to deal with that issue. And to me it's unfortunate. I mean, we're seeing it every day. The storms, those storms are worse and harder. My daughter lives in the Northwest. They've had unprecedented over 100-degree temperatures in Oregon and Washington. I mean, get real here. I mean, the people in the Keys down in Florida are talking about when their land's gone. I mean, it's a shame, but the solution is not to build a 50-foot fence, around them. It just isn't going to work. I mean, it's just sad that they can't recognize it as a problem, because of the partisan divide, and it's a lobbyist divide too. It's the coal producers and the guys pumping oil out of the ground who want to keep pumping carbon. There's a big economic interest behind it. It's just a shame. And it's another one is like the NRA. Everything, trying to deal with gun violence and the massacre of so many people with these automatic weapons. By I don't know. I don't know if they're crazy, but they're certainly determined to act crazy. And you can't do anything about that. It'd be very tiny little steps this year, but nothing that's going to make a big difference in my view. And these shouldn't be such highly partisan issues. But the strength of lobbyists and the media and just what's happened in the legislature to make everybody so angry with the other party and looking at them as villains and idiots, and we don't have to pay attention to them. It's just wrong. I mean, you need to pay attention in the Senate, from the senators from the small states as well as the guys from New York and California. I mean, you need to pay attention to it, but people have to be willing to come, to first recognize there's a problem. And that's the thing that bothers me the most about current politics, is that one party or the other doesn't agree that this is a problem. It's not a problem. I mean, that's been kind of the mantra of the Republicans for a long time with global warming. It's just not a problem. The carbon in the air isn't a problem. We don't want to sacrifice whatever we're supposed to sacrifice. They make fun of the presidents who've gone tried to do some Obama who signed the Paris Accord. Trump gets in and cancels our participation. That shouldn't be partisan. I mean, people should recognize, even if they're Republicans, that there is a problem here and we need to deal with it. But that's the worst thing, is when the partisan divide keeps you from recognizing there's a problem you have to deal with. And I think that's what's happened, unfortunately, with the carbon going into the air. The clean air is not there. It really isn't. We lived in Arizona for a long time. It's a valley. You get this inversion which forces the pollution down into the valley. They go on TV. If you've got a little trouble breathing, stay inside today in air conditioning. Don't go outside and breathe the air. You look at that and you say, why can't both parties realize that that's a problem and try to deal with it? But they don't. It just doesn't happen, and it's a shame, because they're supposed to be representing people, and people are suffering in a lot of areas that nobody is recognizing that that's really a problem. And I'll get off my high horse now.
No.
Go on to something else. But that bothers me.
It seems like politics today really just isn't recognizable from your experience.
No, it is not. It is not. And the Republican Party is not recognizable from my experience. I mean, I went through the 72 thing. I mean, they were talking about civil rights and all kinds of things in there that the Republicans were in favor of. That was the party that I joined. That's the party I was. The party I was in. And it's not the same party. I mean, it's left me. It's left Ned. It's left Ray. I mean, I'm still a registered Republican. But the literature I got, there's a primary today in Michigan. I mean, I voted by absentee or drop box, which I hope continues to be legal. Everybody that sent me literature, and they sent these huge big postcards, who were running for the legislature, running for Congress, running for governor. Well, I didn't get much from the governor candidates. They just didn't have enough money to do it. Was all, I'm more conservative than my opponent. Trump supports me. He doesn't support the other guy. Trump endorsed me. I love Trump. But they're all, they're all just, they support the Second Amendment, but they don't talk about, you've got the right to carry a gun, but don't you have some responsibility? Can't you talk about the responsibility that gun owners have, to keep these terrible weapons, out of the hands of young men who, a lot of them are young men who want to go into schools or malls or wherever, public places, and shoot people. The parade in Chicago, that kid that went into the mall the other day that got shot. These are issues of responsibility. But the NRA people aren't interested in accepting responsibility on behalf of all these people that are carrying all these terrible weapons. It's just to me it's sad. It's sad, and it's sad that people could get elected, just saying those things, saying, I'm in favor of the Second Amendment. I mean, one of the guys, he sent out pictures of him holding a gun. You see it all the time. People going out and shooting in the woods, and putting a video on for their campaign. But they never talk about the responsibility that people have. My brother was a policeman. And he locked it. He came home every night and locked his pistol up in a lockbox that nobody could get in but himself. So his kids couldn't get at it and shoot each other. That's responsible gun ownership. And that should be brought out. That should be enforced by law if necessary. And you go to jail if you don't lock your weapons up. If you give your 15-year-old an AK-47 and he goes and shoots 10 people, you've got some responsibility for that too. But you can't talk about that even, let alone do it in a legislative context. It's just wrong, and it's going to cause, and it's causing the country a lot of problems, and it's going to get worse if it doesn't. If we don't deal with don't all recognize this as a problem. Why Republicans don't recognize that it's a problem, is beyond me. But they don't. They certainly can't talk about a solution. For the gun control or gun safety is a better way to put it. From people's perspective. I despair, and that's I can't do anything about it anymore. I don't have any political power. Except my changed.
Vote or the people I did help in Michigan pass the petition to have a nonpartisan reapportionment. It'll be interesting because this is the first election that new reapportionment is going to work in Michigan. So I'll see if it works out to be a better election, better districts than what they've had before. But who knows? But at least it's not a partisan reapportionment anymore.
True. Wow. Things have changed.
What was the platform of the Republican Party when you served?
For example, and I'll just read a couple of them. We support the community school concept with local community responsibility and control. And I still believe that that's a good thing, and yet we are seeing a growing trend of state legislators and governors, wanting to act as the school board with regard to the curriculum that is taught in schools. And I think the more legislatures stick their nose into the curriculum, the more difficult it's going to be for public education to thrive. I think they ought to deal with local control more than that is now happening. Here's another one: human relations. The Republican Party is open to all groups in full participation. The Republican Party will continue to be the party dedicated to the rights of the individual. The struggle of minority groups to attain these rights has moved into the area of organizing for the reassertion of their individual rights. We encourage their participation in the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party has gotten very much away from that sort of concept. Here at 72, we support the concept of the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, the Republican Party eventually became very much opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. In the environment, the Republican Party of Indiana reaffirms its commitment to assure protection of the environment for all of its citizens and for future generations. Again, I think the Republican Party is not dedicated to the improvement of the environment the way it ought to be these days. I think environmental issues are going to become very more prominent, and it's sooner that the Republicans begin to work with the Democrats to try to solve some of these environmental issues, the better off the country is going to be. And then their final, one of the final paragraphs. We solemnly declare that the Republican Party does not now and will not hereafter advocate the overthrow by force or violence of any local, state, or national government, nor does it advocate or conduct any program of sedition or treason against any such government. I think what happened on January 6th is sedition, if not treason. It certainly was an effort to overthrow the actions of the government to affirm the election of a new president. It's been very unfortunate and unhappy for me to see the number of Republicans of prominence or alleged prominence who have supported President Trump and what he stirred up on January 6th of 2021, I guess it was, and continue to support him and act like if he gets back in power, that's how they're going to act. And I think that is not the Republican Party that I ever belonged to. I belong to the one that just wouldn't support anything like that. And I think the changes, in 40 years in the Republican Party are in many ways very unfortunate. And I was certainly a partisan Republican and a proud Republican for 10 years in the legislature. And I'm not proud of the party these days.
Yeah.
At all.
And so that was the platform of the Indiana Republican Party in 1972?
1974, yeah, 1972, right. The
Okay.
year that I ran the first time. And it was the Republican Party that acted like that for most of my, probably for all of my 10 years that I served in the legislature. Mm-hmm. We cared about those things, although they didn't do as much on the environment as I would like to have seen done, but it wasn't as urgent as it is now. It's more urgent now. And I would just say they should revert to some of those principles and go forward. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they write in 2022, or they probably won't write one in 2022, in 2024. For what they stand for, because it's getting very difficult to understand what they really stand for, other than we want to be in power and we don't like the other guys. That's the impression they give the public, and that's certainly the impression they've given me. It's unfortunate.
Well, let's see. Thinking now of just some big picture reflective questions. So why did you decide to leave the General Assembly?
Well, part of it was political and part of it was personal.
Okay.
I haven't talked about this before, but in 1976, I was fortunate enough to be elected to the leadership of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. I was elected as the majority caucus chairman, the Republicans caucus chairman. So I participated in the leadership from 76 to 80. In 80, and Ned Lampkin had been during that period of time, he had been the House Majority Leader, the number 2 person in the House. And our friendship and political fortunes were, entwined. I wanted to help him. He was going to run for Speaker after the 1980 election, and did run, and was unsuccessful. And I was not successful in being elected as caucus chairman again. So we both lost.
Yeah.
And so, I think Ned, sooner than I, was of the opinion that, he should quit. His legislative career was over. I was still pretty young, so I had to think about it longer. But I do think, that was the Reagan revolution,
Right.
so to speak, in 1980, in that 1980 election. And it was a conservative, a conservative victory. Not as conservative as what we have now. People who call themselves conservatives.
Right.
But certainly, he brought in people into the legislature, who were more conservative than those who had served there. And the legislature and then the leadership took a more conservative viewpoint. And I viewed that as kind of a watershed election in that regard for the conservatives to have more power. And I didn't see a pathway for me in the state legislature to regain leadership or be in leadership.
Yeah.
And after you've been there and you've been involved in making all the decisions, or participating in the making of decisions, you didn't really make them, but you certainly had an influence on all the decisions on important policies that were made. And we had very tight majorities during the 4 years that I was caucus chairman. So it was really hard work to convince, our party, people what to do sometimes, but we did, try to do that. And those are the last 4 years of Governor Bowen, which had been very successful in many ways, and we were able to help him achieve his agenda. And I think all that just kind of, in my view, went away with that 1980 election. Governor Orr, who was his lieutenant governor, became governor. But I think there just became a more conservative bent, and I think I predicted or felt that it was going to continue to get more and more conservative, which it has, since then.
Yeah.
I didn't see a future. I was a moderate, and Ned and I, and Ray were moderates, and we there were a lot of us that were, we had a majority of people who were more moderate in our political views than the people who then took over in 1980. I didn't see it turning in any particular time in the near future. And at the same time, my wife's family had all moved to Arizona, and she'd been near my family ever since we were married, and she wanted to move to Arizona. She thought she could have some opportunities out there with her family, and certainly be close to them. We agreed that we would come back in the summers to Michigan, to be around my family. But she wanted to do that, and I was persuaded by sort of what I felt was the end of my political career, or certainly a hiatus in whatever my political career would be. There was a Republican congressman at that time in our area. There was no pathway there. So I just felt that, you know, it was a good time for me to, and my dad was sick, and he's had given up practicing law. By then he'd retired, and he died soon after we moved to Arizona. And so, you know, I was no longer practicing with him, and although I dearly loved FJ, he was also of an age where he was going to not, you know, practice forever. I didn't think he would practice actually as long as he ended up practicing. And so I was going to have to make a change, you know, with regard to my personal work as a lawyer. And so, you know, I felt I could work in Arizona, you know, as a lawyer. You know, maybe not, I wouldn't certainly have the same kind of wonderful, you know, homespun practice I had is here, but I could do that, and my wife would have opportunities, and we would be around her family, which she really wanted to do, you know, after years of being kind of isolated, not isolated, but certainly not with them as much time as she would like. And she, you know, she had she had three siblings in Arizona, her parents, you know, a bunch of nephews and nieces. And so, you know, that was a pull for us. And when you know, the other thing was I would go to the legislature the last 2 or 3 years, and in January or February, she'd take the girls and go to Arizona where it was 80 degrees and it was 10 degrees here. And that was, you know, that was something that pulled me a little bit towards Arizona. I do like sunshine and warm weather, and Arizona certainly had it. So it was partially personal, partially the thinking. It was kind of you know, the end of, you know, my political career, and so, you know, we made that decision.
Yeah, sure. So, summarizing your time as a state legislator, what would you say about your experience?
It was a wonderful experience. You know, there's a lot of tension. I loved, you know, I loved every minute of it. I loved the politics of it. You know, you get tired campaigning, but I really enjoyed the campaigning. I enjoyed meeting people, you know, giving speeches, you know, acting like I knew what I was talking about, and people thinking I knew what I was talking about. You know, I really enjoyed it, and I thought I played a good role in the legislature the 10 years I was there, a positive role in helping to get through some programs that the party wanted, the governor wanted, and that I wanted personally. So, you know, I felt very, I felt like the 10 years was a nice long time to be in the legislature. I didn't feel like I should serve 40 or 50 years like a lot of people did, even though some of them were my friends, like Dick Mangus served a long time. Ray Richardson served 26 years. I hadn't realized how long he'd served. I just didn't see, you know, doing that. And I think it's good to have turnover, even though I think the turnover that's happened has been unfortunate in the severe conservative bent, although some of the things I think they're doing in legislatures around the country and in Indiana are not really conservative, but they think they are. So you know, I feel very good about it, and I did enjoy it, and I thought I made an impact in you know, I guess more as an attorney and committee work. I mean, a lot of the things that you don't see, you know, behind the scenes are what the committees do and how they work and rewrite legislation and modify it. And I mean, I thought I worked hard at that, and I like to do, you know, I like that. I like doing that kind of work, you know, helping craft and write the legislation. Although, you know, there was obviously a lot of authors with the legislative council and stuff, but I played a role in that, and I liked that. I enjoyed that. So I feel very good about it. I feel it was a good 10 years. I felt it was a good 10 years for the Republican Party, for the state of Indiana, and so I have warm and comfortable friendships, that I've maintained over the years. That's always, sometimes in the long run, that's the most important thing, to have good friends from things that you've done. As I told you earlier, I've got friends from college, I've got friends from law school, I've got friends from, being in high school and grade school. I mean, I've got 2 grade school friends.
Wow.
I talked, we also went to same high school together.
Yeah.
But, I found a picture the other day of my grade school 3rd grade class, and, there's this young woman there, same age as me, we're still friends after all these years. Visited her a couple of years ago. She lives in Virginia now. Friends with her younger sister, who I didn't know, who lives in the South Bend area. We see her in the summer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, making the friendships, that I've kept, and of good people like Ned Lampkin, Ray Richardson, and others, has been important.
Sure.
In enjoying my life and bringing lots of important things to my life. So I feel good about that. I wish I had some more influence than I do now today, but it's, I voluntarily gave it up and never tried to reclaim it anyplace else. So
Right.
I just have to be frustrated in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah. What lessons did you learn from your experiences?
Well, I think one of the lessons was that you have to listen to other people's perspective, but you still have the right to reject it if you don't understand their perspective. That working in the legislature has to be a hard job. And I mean, I observed at my time that there were a lot of people who did not work hard at it. They just were sort of there, I wouldn't call them furniture, but they didn't work hard at the committee work. They didn't work hard at, pushing and sponsoring bills. And, a lot of the work was done, basically, I think a lot of the hard work was done by, 20 or 30 maybe people in the legislature. And I think more people need to, I think people need to work harder. And I think that's the lesson I learned. You have to work hard. You have to look at the details of things. I mean, that really played over into my legal career, following through on knowing all the details, not leaving a stone unturned, really understanding everything about a piece of legislation, and then about a lawsuit. I did commercial litigation most of the time in Arizona. And I did a lot of litigation up in South Bend, but we did other stuff too. But yeah, to be careful about the details, because there's, and the unforeseen consequences of things. I mean, you try in forming legislation to see what the consequences are going to be down the line.
Yeah.
And I think there's not as much attention paid to that sometimes. Having had to litigate what some statutes mean in both Indiana and Arizona, I think sometimes people don't understand the consequences. They don't foresee the bad that's going to come from what they think is good. And, legislators have to really work at understanding that and trying to diminish the harm that some piece of legislation is going to do. And I think that's a lesson I really learned, was, to be able to try to foresee, what the consequences of these actions will be. And that translates to your personal life too. What are the consequences of the decisions you're making, the work you're doing, how you're treating your family and your friends. What are the consequences of that?
Yeah.
So that's a lesson, because almost every important piece of legislation that's passed has unforeseen consequences. And people just they don't see that. You don't see it coming. You try to cut that out, but you can see that every day. They try to do X and it does Y, or it has a consequence nobody thought of, and now they wish it didn't happen. But those are important lessons for life. What are the consequences? What are the foreseeable consequences of action you take? And you have to translate that also to your personal life. I think for most people. I mean, a lot of people, I think, get in trouble in business, in their personal relations, with their family relations, by not understanding not understanding what the consequences of saying this to your children, saying this to your wife, saying this to your friends are going to have. It's unfortunate, but that's a lesson you have to learn. And some people just tell from the number of divorces we have in this country and other problems, other social problems like that, people don't understand the consequences of a bunch of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. What advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
My advice would be to carry on with the theme, try to understand the consequences and how the legislation affects people. And sometimes it's, very simple. I mean, I think right now what they're going through with abortion, there's going to be serious consequences to people. Some very foreseeable at this point, some obviously not. And they need to do something, to mitigate some of the harm that I think may come from that legislation. They need to mitigate, but you always need to do that. I mean, whatever subject you're looking at, criminal statutes, criminal penalties for statutes, how severe are they? Are they too severe? Are we going to have more severe penalties, put people in jail for longer for things that they maybe shouldn't be put in jail, like the possession of marijuana? A lot of states have gone back and, basically pardoned people who were in jail for possession of marijuana when the state has, made marijuana accessible. Michigan and Arizona, both the states that I spend most of my time in, both of them have, recreational marijuana, sales and everything. And I think other states, like Indiana, could profit at least from the idea of letting some of these people, nonviolent offenders, letting them out of jail, which the states that have passed it. I mean, Indiana hasn't passed. I don't think they've even passed medical marijuana. And, I think that, to me, the jury is out a little bit about how it helps people, but it does help people with pain, I guess. Even though I live in two states, I've never used it, don't tend to use it. And I suppose if I got in terrible pain, I might try it, because people who get in terrible pain do try it and claim that they get some relief. But I have a good friend who has tried it to relieve his arthritis pain, and he basically has given up, it's not helping him. So, I don't know. And I think that's an issue to talk about in terms of, we have to study that. Somebody's got to study that to see what the long-term medical effects of use are. We know what the long-term medical effects of smoking cigarettes is. I cannot believe that there aren't serious long-term effects to your health by a long-term use of smoking marijuana.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, there are very few competent studies of what the long-term effects are, with regard to lung health, heart health, other kinds of things.
Right.
So, I would advise legislators to look at that. I don't approve necessarily that it passed, but I think it's probably a good thing to eliminate a whole lot of criminal behavior. And they need to look, I think, at the effects of these private prisons and how they affect long-term incarceration or additional incarceration, because they support, they make a profit from it. We've got a huge incarceration in this country, and we need to take a look at that, what it costs, what it costs in terms of human lives, and I think that's, and you have to look at that, all kinds of policies, but that's one that comes to my mind, because I really worry about the private prison setups that we have in this country. I don't know if they have them in Arizona, in Indiana, but they do have them in Arizona and other states. And I know they unfortunately do lobby for, more severe criminal penalties and, more prisons, etc. And I think they need to take a hard look at gambling. I mean, gambling is great revenue and all these lotteries and, and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of gambling has some very serious effects on a lot of people who get gambling addictions. That's just, it's so easily foreseeable that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
When you put in casinos and stuff, that you're going to get that kind of stuff. And you have to have programs to deal with that. And because I think, drug use and gambling are two things that are very destructive of society, of families. And those are things that need to, be looked at and need to have better programs. And like, we've been talking, or I've been talking about abortion a lot today. You need to look at, taking care of these children that are going to be born that are not wanted. There's going to be more of those because people who seek abortions don't want a child for a lot of reasons, and maybe their own health or whatever, but they're going to have them. I guess the literature shows, or the investigations show, that the people who seek abortions and then don't do it, they keep, are prevented from doing it by state government policies. They don't tend to put the children up for adoption so much as they tend to keep them, and they need help. With daycare, with jobs, all kinds of things to give the children a chance, to thrive in our society. And we need to have, I think, more emphasis on that kind of stuff. How do we give these children a good education, good health care, give them opportunities. And I think that's something that legislatures have been neglectful of over the years, to provide those kind of programs. And it's going to be more important now, as the abortions are being, prevented in greater numbers. So what was the question again?
No, that was just
I'm
about
starting to ramble.
like the advice you'd give to future and current legislators. So.
Yeah. Well, I think the two things are: one, look at the foreseeable consequences. Really understand what they are and do what you can to eliminate the bad consequences. Obviously with legislation, you think you're going to create favorable consequences, but you're also going to create unfavorable ones and outcomes that you didn't anticipate, and be ready to deal with that and take care of people that need help because of what you've done or what you haven't done. Also, when you neglect things, like I think there's environmental neglect, I think is going on. You have to look at how that affects people and how you might do something to alleviate some of that. And gambling is growing. I suspect Indiana will eventually, because there is great revenue in it, will approve marijuana. All their neighboring states, I think, have marijuana. No, Michigan does. I drive from South Bend. I drive by a little place at Edwardsburg. It looks like a garage. It's selling marijuana, and it's got a lineup of probably people from Indiana, because it's 2 miles from the state line. Lined up to buy it all the time, and there are consequences from that. But I think looking at that, and then the other thing is being attentive to the people who don't have spokesmen and lobbyists in the legislature, who don't, people, because most people don't have. They don't belong to a group that's got a formal lobbyist. They don't have a voice, and sometimes even the lobbyists aren't the voice of everybody in the group. The lobbyists don't speak for every school teacher. AFL-CIO doesn't speak for every member of the union. They don't reflect always the views of everybody in the union. So you have to reach out. Some of them will come to you, but you have to reach out and give their thoughts and ideas some influence in the decisions that you make. And it's imperative, I think, to do that, because those are the people that get angry. When they see that whatever happens to them, and maybe it's a consequence of laws, or it's a consequence of failure to appropriate something or do something to try to help them. And their voice isn't being heard, and they feel impotent. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the country now. People who feel that they don't have any influence, and so they just get angry instead of knowing how to channel their activity, into having influence. And the anger is, coming out in unfortunate things that are being said publicly and being done publicly. And I think part of that is just a consequence of not. They're not, the legislators from the Senate, on down to the states, the city councils. I mean, those people you need to reach out to those people who are not represented. A city council, of course, people can get to them easier than they can get to a legislature, or certainly they can get to Congress. That's why you have to reach out. It's not easy for people to reach the legislature. They can write a letter or something, but to really influence, it's hard, and you've got to reach out to them. You've got to go out in your community and talk to them, and hopefully they'll, talk to you in less than more than 4-letter words. They'll talk, some sense, and that's what needs to happen, and it'll change the way people think. I think sometimes if they really talk to people who aren't represented by a group, or who don't speak up for whatever reason, or if they have a lot of anger that they don't know how to express very well, or a lot of problems that they don't know how to express. And some of it, some things that happen, the legislatures, politics can't solve, but there are also ways you can help people if you really know what their problems are and what they're going through. And that's one of the problems, I think, with Congress. They don't really live in their communities anymore. They don't really have to earn a living in their communities. I think that's one advantage that state legislators and city councils and county councils and things like that have, is that they are living and making their fortunes, or they're making their living in a community. And that, so you know more about a community if you're making your living there, as opposed to you're visiting a few weekends a year, to give speeches and have fundraisers. And, I think that's part of the problem with Congress. They are too detached. And I think maybe because of the supermajorities that some places have in this country, either Democrat or Republican, they perhaps aren't reaching out the way they should to a lot of people, because they don't have to. They can ignore everybody else. They don't have to reach out. But people need to reach out. If you want to have a position of power, you need to reach out to people who aren't standing at your door necessarily, and find out what their problems are and how you can deal with them, or certainly how you can eliminate unfortunate consequences of legislation that you pass about the legislation you pass about various occupations, make a big difference. So many occupations have, they want to have a monopoly, like lawyers. Lawyers are the worst. You have, I won't say the worst, but they're bad because they have a monopoly on who can be lawyers, and they enforce it, pretty stringently. And a lot of other occupations who have state control of them, of the occupation, with regulations and everything. A lot of it is, for monopoly purposes, for competitive purposes. And that's one of the things I learned in the legislature, which just popped into my mind, is so many people who come with a problem to the legislature are really looking for the legislature to pass legislation to give them a competitive advantage in something. That goes with tax policy, all kinds of other regulations. They're not looking to be fair. They're looking to get a competitive advantage for their business or their type of business. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to look at that. And I don't know much about what's going on here, or any place really. But I know that from my experience that's what people came to the legislature for sometimes, was to get a competitive imbalance, to get a competitive step up on their competitors in all kinds of occupations and businesses. And you should, I mean, people talk about a level trailing, competitive field.
Yeah.
But everybody, so many people are out there trying to get a competitive edge out of government. It starts with the biggest companies and the most prominent names, in the country in terms of the money that they have. The Microsoft is, tries to get a competitive advantage. Amazon, these big companies, and it applies to small companies too. And legislators, I think, aren't always attuned to that.
Yeah.
And, attuned to what part they play in creating competitive advantages for certain businesses and occupations. And I mean, luckily for the legislature, the lawyers, because of the way they're organized, they can't get into that,
Right.
But they do get into it in medicine. But the Supreme Court does a lot for of regulation of attorneys and stuff that the legislators can't really stick their nose into, which may or may not be unfortunate depending on how you feel about lawyers. But there are a lot of professions with occupations which the legislature does give people competitive advantages.
Yeah. Well, my last question for you then is, what do you want the people of Indiana to know about their influence on the General Assembly?
I think what I think they need to know is that they have to speak up. If it's possible, they have to organize into a group which is always, can present more influence. If there's 10 people speaking, with one voice, or there are 10 people speaking with the same voice, and it makes sense, in some ways. I mean, that's, of course, a very subjective point of view. But, the more people that you can get to agree with you, then the more important your voice is. And you have to reach out because, as I was saying earlier, the legislators, particularly from the Congress level, are more and more detached from their constituents in terms of the time that they have available or they make available to really meet with people in their constituency that aren't active in their particular party. They really don't have the time. In Congress, I don't think they have the time, or they certainly don't make the time to do that as effectively as they should. And the state legislature is the same way. I mean, you go to work, you go 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, you're exhausted. You're not, you don't think about, am I going to go to the Kiwanis meeting and give them a speech, or would I rather stay home and take a snooze? But so you have to reach out to them. You have to organize in productive ways, not just not be against something, but have some positive things to say about what you want to be in favor of. But organization works. I mean, I would tell anybody, in a state like Indiana, try to find people around the state that believe in the same thing you believe in, and try to get them organized, because the organized people are the ones that get the attention. If a lawyer, a legislator gets one letter, maybe he blows it off, doesn't even respond to it. If he gets 10 letters or 20 on the same subject from his constituents, and the guy sitting next to him is getting 10 from his constituents, then that has more influence, on the legislature. You don't necessarily need to belong to a big lobbying organization, but you do have to be organized. If you've got an interest, a special interest, or a financial interest, you have to make you let them know what the consequences are of what they just did or what they're contemplating, because you don't always know it. I mean, it's really hard to know what the consequences are. To foresee what they're going to be, and sometimes they don't show up for a couple of years on some things that you pass that you thought was, that always hurt me as a legislator. I mean, personally, when you would pass something you thought was good, everybody had thought it was good, hell, maybe it passes 92-2 or something, and you think it's good, and and 2 years later somebody comes up and says, well, you passed this, it hurt my business, or it hurt my child in school or whatever. And that's always something you don't, I mean, I never wanted to hear that, but you did hear it. You did hear it from time to time, that what you did was harmful. And then, then it's possible sometimes you can go back and correct it, but sometimes you can't, it becomes entrenched,
Yeah.
and so you can't always correct it. And that's always hurt. I mean, if you're a human, you feel hurt when something like that has happened. You've really hurt somebody's life in some way or another by some act that you thought was good, and it turned out not to be. But and so you just have to be careful. And it's hard to foresee stuff. I mean, I understand that.
Right. Well, is there anything that I didn't ask about that you wanted to mention, or?
Not really. I mean,
Okay.
I think I've been on the soapbox about a few things.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a few other things that I worked on.
Sure.
Some of which I can't remember, but without digging into the
Right.
record. But the
Right.
the record of what I sponsored and what I did, it's there. I'm pretty proud of the things that I worked on and sponsored. With one or two exceptions, but pretty much. I mean, one of them I remember. We were in the 73 or 74 when we were in the minority. It just popped into my head. I was asked to sponsor a bill that was supposed to be about the safety of manhole covers.
Okay.
And somebody that I liked came to me and said, "Will you be my Republican sponsor?" And I looked at it and it made sense to me, so I said, "Sure." Well, so we get to the committee meeting, and it's been a 20-year fight between, a union and, maybe an employer or two unions about these damn manhole covers,
Oh my gosh.
Whoa, I didn't sign on for this,
Yeah.
So I was kind of embarrassed by that, but, it was a long, I just didn't know enough about it
Yeah.
to have been smart enough to say no. But, so I mean, those things kind of happen in the legislative process. But I basically feel very comfortable with my record and the stuff that I sponsored. I always tried to do something that improved,
Right.
or reformed things. And I tried not to get into helping somebody get a competitive advantage over somebody else, and that did come up from time to time. You have to watch out and not do things as much as do things.
Yeah.
That's because you can get bit pretty hard if you do something you really don't know what you're doing. With like that manhole cover thing I was talking to you
Yeah,
about.
that's funny. Yeah.
These, a huge fight that had gone on for, it seemed like centuries, Here I was taking sides and didn't even know there were two sides, so.
Yeah.
That's, ignorance is not always bliss.
Right,
In that
right.
particular case, it was not bliss. But no, I think this has been a good process. I really have enjoyed it. And I hope somebody besides you listens to it sometime, Ben. But if they don't, that's okay. I feel good. I feel good about my service. I feel good about what I said here. And if I think of anything profound, maybe in the future, I'll ask to come back and add something to it.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Thank you so much for being part of the project, and you can preserve this history now.
Yeah.
So.